This is Beyond the Bubble, Alternative Proteins Take 1, 2, 3, 4.
So we've been hearing a lot lately about alternative proteins and synthetic foods, and we heard a lot about it with the Impossible Burger fiasco in the media. Richard, you've researched this area quite extensively, and what's your sort of take on it? What's driving this shift?
Well, it's a really complicated topic. That's my first take, I suppose. But people or consumers are starting to really look into how food's being produced, and there's this pressure coming on in terms of climate change and global emissions, and people are starting to look at food production and ask the question of, can it be done better? Is there a better way? And it's a legitimate question. So I guess companies around the world have picked up on this challenge and using new technologies and marketing them and looking at new supply chain opportunities and basically having a crack. So
is this something that New Zealand farmers are looking at?
There's small pockets, I think, and maybe small opportunities, but at the moment New Zealand seems to be mostly grappling with how we approach it as a threat, I guess, or how we work through it. Yeah.
You've actually expressed some scepticism in the shift towards alternative proteins and synthetic foods, and you're saying that this is a venture capitalist's dream and that they're jumping in on it, but they're not necessarily driven by altruistic environmental concerns. It's more about making money.
Yeah, there is a lot of venture capital money behind it, and that process is, you come up with an idea, you get a whole lot of funding to make it happen, and then you employ lots of people to make it happen, and then you go, sort of thing, which is totally foreign to how I suppose a farmer does things. So that is a big part of it, but at the same time, it's engaging with, they're picking up on things that people are genuinely worried about. So they're connecting with people, and they're and there's products out there now. So clearly, there's a business model that's working as well.
John and Melissa, you've had quite a bit to do with alternative proteins. You've been to a protein tech conference quite recently, and you've said that a major risk to the industry is that these alternative proteins are going to start replacing ingredients in everyday sort of foods, and that consumers are not really going to notice or care.
Well, if you look at the last probably 20 odd years of processed food, a lot of ingredients have changed and have been added to processed foods. When was the last time you read the back of a Mars bar? You don't really think about what's in those foods, and the bulk of what we produce in terms of meat and dairy gets exported and made into other foods in other places. So if that shifts, and there are good reasons why manufacturers might want to choose a cheaper product, that's going to have a massive impact on our future markets. So that's where I see the biggest impact as being, is alternative protein happening to us rather than something that we actually get involved in necessarily.
Recent research shows that the 5 biggest global dairy and meat producers, including Fonterra, have the same greenhouse gas footprint as ExxonMobil. And New Zealand is going to have to reduce up to 1/5 of its livestock methane emissions to stop global warming, or just to stay where we are now. Is there a sense of inevitability in switching to these alternative proteins?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing is looking at the assumption of that these alternative proteins actually have a lower environmental footprint. And in the study that I did, looking at different production processes, I would say generally the plant-based proteins probably do slightly at the moment, but I'm really sceptical around the ultra-processed, lab-based meats and milks. To me, what I saw, the energy use is really high, and ultimately the carbon footprint higher than conventional production as well. Yes, everyone has to change. Everyone has to make efforts to reduce global emissions, and there is heaps of scope for farmers to do it too.
The research from Beef and Lamb has shown that there's still going to be a really high demand for the real thing, but it's going to probably have to be really high quality and hormone-free and natural. So is this something that might become the new norm, quality over quantity?
I think you're going to see two ends. We already have a two-speed meat industry in New Zealand, in a sense. You have sheep and beef farmers who produce, they farm for meat, and then we have dairy farmers who produce meat almost as a byproduct of their business. And those two speeds, I think, are going to continue for quite some time. What we'll see is that the sheep and beef farmers are moving, they already have moved higher and higher up the value chain. They've reduced emissions markedly in their production, so it's 30% overall. We're going to continue to see them offsetting, so 25% of New Zealand's native forest is on sheep and beef farms in New Zealand, and we'll see under the Billion Trees program that increase. So I still think there's quite a few things that we'll see happening in the industry that will reduce emissions. What we're also looking at is how do we not end up in the commodity markets, because again, as global dairy is increasing, the commodity meat availability globally is increasing, because you have to kill cows at some point to keep producing dairy, right? So I think New Zealand has to move up the food chain. It has to be going for the best provenance possible. So yeah, companies like Provenance Lamb, you know, companies that are really branding themselves as high quality. It has to taste good to meat eaters, but it has to be produced compassionately, high animal welfare, and I think soil is actually the next big area that we're going to see our consumers campaigning on.
John, you've suggested in an epic Twitter feed that perhaps there's a two-track approach, that either New Zealand really focuses on what it does best, which is very efficient farming with high quality products that we can market to the world, or one where we actually try to take on the alternative proteins, try to get amongst that and really become a global player. Do you think it's an either or? Can we do a bit of both? Does New Zealand have the capacity to do that?
I mean, the danger of going down the alternative protein track to compete with other countries is that we end up getting onto another commodity race to the bottom, because those products will just get cheaper and cheaper over time. For me, the response to climate change is almost exactly a mirror of the response to alternative protein. We're going to end up with ultimately less hooves on the paddocks, but what we do produce will be absolutely top quality. There'll be an impeccable story behind it of transparency and provenance, and we have to go beyond zero impact agriculture to actually creating a system that builds the land and heals the land, and that's what's going to be our selling point in the future. And I think if we can't do that, then we're in trouble.
We'll probably just end with a question to each of you. Given the challenges that are facing farmers and all the external forces that they can't control, like politics and climate change, growing populations, fake meat, are you hopeful for the future of agriculture in New Zealand? And what is your vision for what an effective, functioning, low emissions farming sector may look like in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years?
As you said at the start, ultimately everyone still needs food, so yeah, I'm obviously hopeful for the agriculture worldwide. I think the opportunity is the same in rebuilding agricultural systems, rebuilding the soil so that it's actually functioning better, you know, growing better quality food and filtering water and that sort of thing. That's where the opportunity is for us too. So, and that's a really exciting space at the moment, I think.
Are farmers going to need assistance to do that?
Yeah, totally. It's new frontier stuff, so it's exciting times.
Melissa?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we have a real opportunity here to put some stakes in the ground and decide as Team New Zealand how we want to play, and I think that's going to mean some hard decisions in some areas. But I don't think farmers should feel threatened by those. I think they should actually see that their consumers care about the product. Like, the worst thing would be to produce a product that no one gave a shit about, right? And that happens all the time, whereas this is a product that your consumers are passionate about. And I think that's the way that farmers should try and think about it, is that they have passionate consumers and we need to produce a product that they really want.
Joe?
We need a whole of country approach, and I think, you know, I'm always loath to use the New Zealand Inc. term, but we do need, as a primary sector, we need to actually have a unified approach and to climate change, but also synthetic proteins, because that for me is the huge threat that's on the horizon. And really for us, failure is not an option, because we rely so much on agriculture for our economy that, you know, we really can't let this one go. There is huge hope if we can do it right, but we've got to be really realistic about the challenges that we face and the investment and effort required to turn this around. It's going to be a big job, but we can do it, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Really interesting conversation. That's another episode of Beyond the Bubble. See you soon.